Tonight on RFL, one-on-one with Pat Lynch, president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, the PBA, speaking with RFL about the decision in the Eric Garner case. And as you'll hear, he is none too happy with the feds stepping in.
Why is it that it's police officers that always get that double jeopardy? Well, if we don't like the result in this grand jury of this trial, well, let's run to Washington and get them to review. And then you have a review there. Does that happen to anyone else?
And to Washington, where Senate Democrats out with a new jaw-dropping report criticizing the CIA's torture tactics used during the Bush administration with unbelievable graphic detail. Tonight, we speak with a professor from Fairleigh Dickinson University about what this report means for both the White House and the Pentagon. Plus, from flooding to icy roadways, we're getting the latest tonight on the winter weather situation. It's all coming up. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight, a sea of protests are flooding the nation for yet another day. Protesters just about every corner of the country, they're still speaking out against a grand jury decision in both Ferguson, Missouri and in Staten Island. As you all know, both juries found that the white police officers accused of shooting and killing unarmed black men should not be indicted. Now, New Yorkers and also protesters across the country, they are bracing themselves for what is yet to come as a grand jury prepares to decide whether rookie NYPD officer Peter Leong should face charges in the shooting death of 28-year-old Akai Gurley. Mr. Gurley was accidentally gunned down in a poorly lit stairwell of a housing complex in Brooklyn. Now, Pat Lynch, the president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, he's spoken out on the Garner case, and he is now speaking out about Gurley's death as well. And our own Dominic Carter spoke one-on-one with Pat Lynch earlier today. Dom?
Well, Richard, first of all, quoting PBA President Pat Lynch from our interview, why do people automatically think police officers are wrong? Why do we listen to agitators on the street in every case? From Lynch's point of view, the officer regarding Eric Garner, Daniel Pantaleo, should be returned to full active duty. First of all, Mr. Lynch, we want to thank you for joining us tonight, and we want to start by offering our condolences to you. We understand you just recently lost your mom.
I appreciate Dominic, and I appreciate all the words of support and prayers from so many different folks that some knew my mother, some didn't. She was a good woman. She was 92 years old. She led a good life, and unfortunately, life has to end somewhere. But I appreciate everything from everybody.
Okay. Well, let's move on now to the police matters. And before I get to Eric Garner, let's talk about the Gurley case in Brooklyn. Police officer, housing project stairwell, accidentally shoots Mr. Gurley. Gun was drawn. We'll get to all of that. But there's a report. We know that the officer didn't report the shooting for 6 minutes. 6 minutes. And in that time, it's alleged that instead of calling for medical attention or the police department, he was on the phone with the union rep, if you will. Number one, is that true that he was on the phone with a union, texting a union rep?
Quite frankly, we don't know where these reports are coming from because the police officers involved, the police officer involved in the shooting have not been interviewed at the request of the district attorney, which is routine. So where these reports are coming from, I don't know. I'm reading them in the newspaper the same as you. I don't believe they're true. But what we ask here is allow the investigation to be based on the facts. And the facts aren't out yet.
Okay, but with so many procedural failures in that case, why in the world is the PBA defending this officer?
First off, making that assumption that there was all sorts of mistakes and there's been no investigation as of yet, well, we can't come to that conclusion yet. And some would ask, why do you defend police officers? Well, why do folks automatically blame police officers? If you read the headlines, every time there's a shooting, every time there's an incident, the police officer is wrong. Where the facts get lost in the fiction that you hear on the street. All we ever ask for in this case or any other case is fairness. Our role as the PBA is to make sure there's fairness in the process, and at the end of that process, we get to the truth, whatever that truth may be.
So you're telling us it's not confirmed that he was texting his union rep at the time?
It couldn't be. They have not been interviewed. So where that came from, I haven't the foggiest idea.
Is there a concern that defending every questionable police-related shooting that you risk not being taken seriously when there is a legitimate case?
Well, if you look at it, and that's said, and I've heard it before, but it's not actually true. We defend our police officers. That's our role. We're advocates for police officers. But what we're always doing is holding back a tidal wave of criticism on every case. So I would turn that question around and say, why do people automatically think police officers are wrong? Why do we listen to rabble-rousers and agitators on the street in every case? Most of these cases, we're called there by the communities in which we serve because there's a problem, and folks are safe because of police officers. So it's not that we jump to defend, is we're holding back a tidal wave of criticism, which 99.9% of the time is wrong and unwarranted.
There are, Mr. Lynch, protests, as you well know, all around the country regarding the grand jury not indicting in the Garner case. Even President George W. Bush said he was surprised. LeBron James at the basketball game last night wearing a T-shirt during warm-ups at the Nets game that said, quote, "I can't breathe." Doesn't that tell you that perhaps something is terribly wrong with the results that came back from the grand jury?
No, what it tells me is folks are like lemons following just what they're hearing. And the question I ask is this. We had a grand jury seated, a mixed grand jury of gender and race, and they looked at every piece of evidence that was presented. 60 pieces of evidence, I believe, and 50 witnesses, and the witnesses varied in where they were from. And they looked at every aspect, including the medical examiner's report. And then they came to this conclusion. None of us have that information. I don't have it. You don't have it. And with respect to our past president, the president doesn't have it. But we're coming to conclusions. Why would you criticize a table of jurors who took their oath seriously, weighed all the evidence, and then came to a conclusion? And because we don't like the conclusion, we start criticizing it.
But, Mr. Lynch, you know what the critics say. They say that in Staten Island the deck was stacked, that the fix was in by the district attorney, and that many police officers live in Staten Island, and retired police officers and their families, and that a police officer is going to get the benefit of the doubt way going to the extreme.
What I find, and I've been doing this for a day or two, is that the jurors, when they take that oath, they take it seriously. Many times the cases and the result is what we're pleased with, and many times we're not. You know that. I've sat in these interviews on both sides. And to say Staten Island is one way as compared to another, 60% of New York City police officers live in the confines of New York City. They don't all live in Staten Island. They live in all the boroughs that are there. But nonetheless, those folks, more than anyone else, if you're related to a police officer, will look at the facts. Because why? Because what we're looking for is fairness for our family members. We're looking for fairness for our PBA members as well.
Mr. Lynch, you referred to Officer Pantaleo as an Eagle Scout. Come on, Mr. Lynch.
Well, that's a fact. And what I did is, there's been an awful lot of information out there, but the information that was not out there, because the police officer is restricted from talking until he goes through this process, is what he was about. And that's a fact. He's a member of that community in which he served, a lifelong city resident of Staten Island. He was an Eagle Scout.
But
he
isn't
did
it
help
inflaming
folks.
the situation?
No, it's not inflaming the situation, because what we're saying is, here's what this police officer is about. Let's put a face on him. Because what's happening is we're getting condemned for every issue and every ill or every misperceived notion across the country is now landing on this police officer. So let's tell a story of what he's about, where he's from, what his family is about. And everything I said was the absolute truth. I didn't embellish. That's the fact. He's the kind of guy, when he was a young person, he would take folks to camp that couldn't afford to do it. That's the kind of police officer, that's the kind of man he was. So what we're trying to do is say, this is a police officer involved in a terrible circumstance. Let's put a face on him. We're not all faceless and we're not all the same.
But Mr. Lynch, he was also accused of 2 cases involving allegedly where he violated the rights of minorities.
As you know, and it was proven in Staten Island through reports, that there's law firms there that automatically file suits against the city in any arrest that was happening. If you're an active police officer, you're going to have lawsuits. Then you go into the city, and we've criticized this, where the city automatically settles. It's a nuisance suit. Just pay the money and they'll go away. Who ends up paying for it? the citizens of the city financially, but that police officer that's wrongfully sued, and it looks like he did something wrong. Meanwhile, there's never any wrongdoing involved. It literally is, it's going to take too much to defend, let's just pay.
But the allegation is that he strip searched someone in public, made them take off their clothes.
As you said, an allegation of a lawsuit with an active police officer. There's lots of allegations against all of us. That's why we stand there and say, let there be an investigation that's come to a conclusion after that investigation, not before.
You called Officer Pantaleo a good cop in a bad situation. But did he have to move in this situation? He couldn't have talked to Mr. Garner to de-escalate the situation?
If you take the video as a whole, and I understand the grand jury saw more than one video from different angles, it didn't jump into the struggle. It started with a conversation. They did try to de-escalate it by saying, look, you're being placed under arrest for this. You've been here before. You'll know you'll be out by the end of the day with a desk appearance ticket. Those conversations were had to de-escalate it. They didn't jump right into it. They waited for a supervisor to arrive. And then Mr. Garner unfortunately said, I'm not going. He decided that he is going to resist arrest. Well, a police officer doesn't have an option to walk away. Once we come to the decision that there's going to be arrest, you have to comply. If you feel it's unjust, there's mechanisms to complain. We can duke it out in front of the judge in court. But to resist arrest leads to tragedy, and unfortunately, that's what happened in this case.
Well, we're talking about the video. At the end of the video, mocking the crowd that was there, apparently, where we see Officer Pantaleo waving at the camera.
And I can't answer for that, quite honestly, and maybe that was addressed in the grand jury, I don't know. Maybe it was nervousness or otherwise. I actually don't know. But what I can look at is, does this deserve to go to the grand jury? Was there a crime committed? And in New York State, a chokehold, as some are saying, which I do not believe it was, is not illegal. But nonetheless, this was a takedown maneuver. So what we have to do is take the video and take all the circumstances involved, just not the part that proves what we want to argue.
Mr. Lynch, do you see a scenario as the president of the PBA where Officer Pantaleo can keep his job or return to duty?
I think he should, if he goes through the process, and he did.
You think he should keep his job?
And he goes through a review in the police department, and everyone under the sun is going to come and say they want to review. But the reality is the facts remain what they are, the evidence is what it is, and the testimony is not going to change. If that grand jury came to this conclusion, whether we agree with it or not, that should be the conclusion. And if that conclusion is no true bill, this police officer, after the department investigation, should be allowed to go on with the job, which will be difficult because he has to live with this death for his entire life. But nonetheless, if the facts lead us there, then he should be exonerated.
Richard, in part 2 of the interview, which will air on Thursday night, things will get a little heated regarding Lynch's point of view that Pantaleo should return to active duty. Take a look.
Let me ask the folks, let me ask you, Dominic, if you are wrongfully accused and then you go through a process and it's shown that exactly what folks said didn't happen, that it really didn't happen that way, and you're exonerated, isn't that what this country's about? If you go through the investigation, you go through the decision, and it comes out that you're no true bill, well, what, ban them to bogey land? This is not the cartoon.
Yes. All right. We're going to get into that here and more. So tonight, let's start this conversation on this issue. We've got Dominic Carter, of course, here, and Andrew Whitman, senior political correspondent. You know, before we get to the Gurley case, there's this perception, and I don't think it's an unfair one, Dom, that the PBA, regardless of the situation, is going to have the cops back. That's their job. But if they defend to the hilt what happened the same way that they did in the Garner case, that they do in the Gurley case, for example, I think there becomes a point here where, you know, it's like the boy who cried wolf, when there really is an officer that's either wrongfully accused or that there's questionable, questions that surround the incident. No one's going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, look at the Gurley case. Guy's walking out of an apartment, doing nothing wrong in a building that he lives in, and a cop shoots him. Cop didn't intend to kill anyone that night, but he shouldn't have had his gun out. Gun shouldn't have been off the safety here. And Then reportedly, he waits 7 minutes before he calls EMS because he's calling his PBA rep first. Point is, that's indefensible, right? So if you're coming down on the side saying they did nothing wrong and they should stay on the job for doing that, it's hard to take them at face value for everything.
Well, first of all, regarding this 6-minute time period and where apparently texting, as Mr. Lynch just said, according to the union and their delegates, that did not happen, according to Mr. Lynch.
I didn't hear a clear denial. He said, we haven't been able to question him, so we don't know.
Right. He did also say
and
that.
My cynical side goes up by now. If they knew they didn't have anything, I think they would have said it a little bit more definitively in your interview, but time will tell.
But I guess in fairness of Mr. Lynch, when these things go down, he is right. There's such an avalanche, if you will, of information and criticism against the police officer. The police officer cannot talk publicly. They would be a fool to do so when they're looking at a criminal investigation. Yeah. So somebody has to speak up for the officer. But also, the union points out, I had a private conversation with them for about 30 minutes on this topic. And they said, Dominic, and I don't even know if I should be revealing this, but they said, Dominic, it's not accurate that we represent every police officer. They have, in terms of when these questionable cases go down, they have said on some of these cases, Richard, that when they know that it's shaky and that the officer has done something wrong, they just won't say anything at all.
But you know, Andrew, and I know we're going to hit a break here, but they originally said in the Gurley case, in that stairwell, hey, the city fixed the light bulb, we wouldn't have had a problem. They said in the Garner case, well, if the guy was in better shape here, he wouldn't be dead today or something like that. There are tone-deaf comments that seem to, in effect, be blame the victim, you know? And I'm telling you, again, in an unscientific poll here, that's as much what sets people off as anything else. It's like when the body lays in the street for 4 hours in Missouri. That bothered people almost as much as the shooting itself.
I agree with you 100%, but I don't think anybody should take what Pat Lynch is saying at face value without a huge pile of salt, not just a grain to go with it. He's a partisan. It's like asking...
But don't you think it's reflective of the police perspective on this?
It's like being surprised when we have a Republican on here who continues to defend, you know, shutting down the government whenever the rest of the panel says, well, that makes no sense. Well, of course it does to them, so...
Okay, but there's one thing, Andrew. There's a debate, and we don't know what the answer is, but just your instinct. There's one thing with being an advocate, because that's your job. It's like in the players' union, when you had all the drug scourge that, you know, they fought all kinds of testing for so long, even what the public want, because they were defending their particular constituency. But do you think it's reflective of the rank and file of the police, where they're feeling that they're victimized after every incident to presume guilty here, and even though the process seems slanted in their perspective in the last few cases, they still feel that, you know, it's them against the world? And he's not speaking just for his constituency, he's speaking for what they believe.
If you talk to cops, you're going to find a number of them want the quick trigger cops, the more brutal cops off the force. They just can't say it publicly. The same way you talk to a teacher privately and they'll say, yeah, you know, I'm a member of this teachers union, but I don't support the rubber room. I don't like the way that you can't fire a bad teacher. There are bad seeds in every bag. You can't blame the organization that seeks to defend all of those all
what
of
have
those
we
people.
found time and time again, whether it's with the church, whether it's the teachers or whatever, the longer you protect those that bring down the institution, or at least, you know, in this case, the vocation, you harm the whole bunch here. And I think being proactive is better. It's easier said than done.
You're going to have to put the police union in a position where they have to make concessions
Yep.
When dealing with bad cops. They're not going to do it on their own.
Dom, in addition to hearing the part 2 of your interview where it does get heated with Mr. Lynch, we're also going to be hearing from another representative for the police this week too, right?
Yes, we will be sitting down in the very near future with Mr. Mullins of the Sergeants Benevolent Association. It's very important that while we've had exclusive interviews with the families and so on from the Garner side, that we get the law enforcement side as well.
And again, there's even a little daylight between Mullins and Lynch here in terms of where they believe justice has or hasn't been served here. We'll be fascinating conversations again later this week. All right, when we come back here, we're going to have a couple things. A little bit later on the show, we'll have a look at those massive protests that we've seen in so many places. I'm going to ask you at home if you think that these protests here have been productive, or do you think that they're just disruptive and taking away from the broader message? We're going to get into that. But when we come back, we'll take a look at a major piece of news out of Washington today. CIA torture. We are learning the gruesome details of what went on here and what we were told didn't happen that actually did. Andrew will have that report after this.